What I want to look at are these lovely pictures and go through the work that they was so well illustrated by so many of these artists. There are over 700 paintings and drawings of rural working women from the 18th and 19th century. And then as soon as photography came in, professional photographers started taking photographs of those women, but nearly always very staged. So they're often wearing costumes that they wouldn't normally have worn. Whereas the drawings and paintings are almost certainly of the sort of costumes that they really did wear. The really interesting thing I think about women in 18th and 19th century Wales is they became an icon of Wales. The Welsh hat, which was first used around 1840, is so unique and distinctive that it becomes a symbol of Wales very soon after its invention. And I'd say invention, but we don't actually know how the Welsh hat developed, really, although I've got theories about it. But this illustration, which comes from Punch magazine, the English version, because there was a Welsh version, shows all the symbols of Wales, including on the left, a woman with a leek in her hat, and she's wearing a bedgown, the sort worn in North Wales, the goats, Prince St. David as a baby, the Prince of Wales feathers, a bard playing a harp, a song presumably to do with Welsh rabbit, another goat, and what looks like a drunk Welshman, also with a leek in his hat. He's wearing a top hat, quite distinct from the slightly conical Welsh hat. In contrast to the hundreds of pictures of women, there are very, very few of men, and nearly all of the illustrations of men are of eccentric men, the guides who took people up Snowdon and Caderidris and elsewhere, and the men who wore unusual costumes, mostly so they could get a slightly larger sum of money from the tourists that they showed around. So here is one of the few men that we have in illustrations, and the boy beside him, sitting there waiting for their supper, no doubt, not contributing much to the domestic household tasks. Deirdre Beddoe, who's written an awful lot about 19th century women in particular, said that Welsh women are culturally invisible. But I actually disagree with her on that because of what I've already said. She says that whenever we think of Wales, we think of miners, of male voice choirs and rugby. And also, if you think about who was running the country, most of the politicians were men. All the MPs were men until the first Welsh woman MP, the daughter of Lloyd George, Lady Megan, who became an MP for a while. And of course, all the ministers of churches and chapels were men. But my feeling is that many of the women had control over what was going on in the home and around the hearth. So Wales during the 18th and 19th century was a land of extreme contrasts. And there were the two really big industries. Most people were involved in agriculture at the beginning of the 18th century. Towards the end, of course, industry took over. And the impression that the tourists give of the people they met is that they were happy, healthy, and handsome. And I want to question that. That's what they seem to repeat over and over again, but I'm quite sure that's what they wanted to see, not necessarily what they actually saw. And they may well have turned a blind eye to the ill and the infirm and the aged, because nearly all the pictures are of young, attractive women. The other thing that they were impressed by, it seems, was that they were living in harmony with their environment. And they may well have been until, of course, industrialisation destroyed large areas of the land of Wales while it was being exploited for the natural resources. Whether they were creative, especially the women, we do not know. Somebody not long ago gave a lecture, and I think it's been published, but I haven't found it yet, on whether women wrote poetry very much. There is almost no evidence to suggest that women wrote poetry, but the chances are they did. It's just that it hasn't survived in the same way that it has for poetry written by men. So there's this enormous gap in our knowledge simply because the evidence hasn't survived. It's to do with this hidden history, which is linked to a great extent by women's history, and the fact that most of it is hidden, permanently hidden, I think, sadly. So is this idea that these people were happy, healthy and handsome and creative and living happily in their environment, is this history as wished for? Well, I think some of it is, but it's the only evidence that has survived. Then we have the other major industry in Wales, which was the exploitation of copper, especially in North Wales, of lead in Mid Wales, of slate in North and Mid Wales, and of coal in South Wales and Flintshire, of course. And very large areas of land were completely spoiled and polluted by the results of industrialization. The jobs were better paid for the men, but the conditions of working were very poor, often quite dangerous. There were fumes from places like the copper works on Anglesey, which damaged people's lungs and destroyed the plants around the site. And there was a lot of criticism at the time that by moving into towns which grew up around the industry, that the people were exposed to immorality. And the tourists liked the idea that the people living in Wales were pure and not aware of the immorality that was apparently prevalent in England. But an awful lot of what is said, especially the critical bits, are from an English perspective. The people who wrote the Blue Books, the account of the state of education in Wales in 1847, and the report onto the state of land in Wales in 1896, when they tried to find out who owned land and how it was leased out. Those are often very critical of the Welsh, and especially of their immorality. But a lot of Welsh people criticise those reports, and it's quite clear that many of the officials who came around to ask questions couldn't understand Welsh, and they were asking children questions in English, and they couldn't be understood by the children. So their lack of knowledge was purely to do with lack of communication. So women's work. A lot of women were based at home and working around their own domestic sphere. The men may well have gone off from the home either every day to work on the farm in the fields, or by the week to work in the industry, and they would have travelled on a Sunday night, spent the week away and came back on perhaps on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. And that was quite common. And also a lot of them were away for months, if not longer, at sea. So the women were left to their own devices, maintaining traditions, we think, but that's difficult to prove. And of course, something that women are always very good at, multitasking, and I'll illustrate some of that as we go along. The other significant difference between the men and women is that the women were not paid for their work, unlike the men. But they did have pocket money, because what many of them did was sell their services, in this case washing, to local people, and had small sums of money for that. Or they went to market and sold the produce of the farm, eggs and butter and cheese and animals and that sort of thing. So they always had a bit of money in their pocket, and they could afford to spend some of that at the fair on things like needles and cotton and ribbons to decorate their clothes, and occasionally some new items of clothing. Whereas the men, especially the farmers, may not have money very much in their pockets until they sold something quite big at a market or fair. And the Welsh saying that a man has just sold his pig meant that he was drunk, because he had enough money in his pocket from selling a pig to buy enough alcohol to get drunk. So, as I've already said, the visitors hope to find happy, healthy, hardworking, innocent, content people. And I think content is an important word, and I'll come to that at the end. I'm quite sure that the women working on the fields would not wear their best tall hat. These are not Welsh hats. They may look like it, but Welsh hat, as I said, wasn't introduced until the 1830s. They may be the precursor of the Welsh hat. And the significant thing that you can see on this picture is that the brims are curved, whereas in a Welsh hat, they're always flat. But they do look far too well dressed to be working in the fields like that. And I think this is artist taking a bit of license to make them look prettier and more attractive than perhaps they were. We've got a few pictures of extremely poor people, but they, I think, were produced because they were exceptionally poor. So we've got this lovely picture from South Ceredigion of a house, tumble down ruin, really, and a very poor woman standing outside. You can see the holes in her apron, and you can imagine the state of the cottage on the inside. But if you know the story of Shani Bob Clay from Shani Bob Man, from Newquay, she looked like this and she lived in a hovel. But when she died, apparently, the story goes, there were £100 in sovereigns under her bed, which she left to the local hospital. So in this case, well, in her case, she chose to use her money in a particular way. Several tourists suggest that women were much harder working than the men. So this is a Mr. Martin touring Wales in 1801. I cannot speak too highly of the industry of the Welsh women and the idleness of the men. The former always knitting as they walk along, even with heavy loads on their heads. And they must make a number of stockings, which I suppose they sell, for they all go barefoot and bare skin, as they themselves turn it. Well, this picture of a woman walking to market with a basket on her head full of goods to sell is actually wearing shoes, possibly with patterns underneath to keep them out of the mud, which is quite unusual because lots and lots of evidence suggests that most women walked barefoot, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And we also have the same man saying, I mentioned to my landlord that the women appeared to be more industrious than the men, and he declared the observation was just. And except for mowing and digging, the women worked much better than the men, although they were paid but 7p a day when the men received a shilling, which he considered unfair. So we have this lovely picture of a woman drawn by a French visitor with a picture on her head. I don't know what would be inside it. And she's knitting and walking barefoot. And that was apparently quite a common sight in Wales at the time. One of the things that young girls could do is to become maidservants, either in large farms or in the houses that are better off. And that is where they learnt English. And so if a tourist came to an area and wanted to guide to the local waterfall, which was often necessary, it wasn't unusual for a young woman to take him because she could speak English, whereas the young boys who'd spent all their time in the fields with their fathers hadn't learnt English. And that was a great advantage to the young women, who would then get a shilling or two, as much as their father might earn in a day, for taking a tourist to a waterfall. And you get servants in inns who also needed to speak English, because some of the travellers, rather than tourists, and tourists as well, of course, would only speak English. So they needed English speakers at the inns, and that was the case quite clearly. And here we got almost certainly the maidservant sitting by the fire watching the spit turning with the dog in the wheel above, like the one that you can see at St Fagans now, the Museum of Welsh Life. And here we got a lovely picture of a chambermaid tripped up or fallen over through shock for some reason or other. This is the Goat Inn in Bydd. We know that from the context of the volume in which this picture was found. And two of the tourists are there. One's already been out for a walk, possibly to do some painting. The other one's been lying in bed. And the maidservant, dressed in nicely striped Welsh costume, is tripped up on the floor and spilt her water jug. So those are jobs that the young women would do. And here's yet another example from the same volume, actually, near Bydd. On a stormy day, the group of people who, one of whom was responsible for these drawings, spent a whole week in the inn there, waiting for the rain to stop. and I don't think they ever got up Snowdon. But here is the maidservant, again in a traditional Welsh costume, a little bit ragged at the bottom, giving support to one of the tourists. And there's a young man here moving stones so that the tourist doesn't get her feet wet, whereas the maidservant has got her feet well in water. And the postilion, or the coach driver here, laughing at them on the right. It's a lovely image, but this is one of the jobs that the young women would do, and to get significant sums of money. So they're the very youngest of the Welsh women. Then we get to the period when they're old enough to find a mate. And there's this comic postcard of them all on the Welsh mountains, all wearing Welsh hats. Obviously, we don't know a lot about this. We do have love spoons that have survived that were supposed to have been carved by the young men for their girlfriends. And there's lots of those. They're found in Wales and in Scandinavia to a large extent too. Lovely picture again by Ibbotson. There's many of Ibbotson's pictures in this talk. And here we got a young woman thrashing a young man who's obviously giving her too much attention, probably with a wet piece of fabric, which would have hurt him, I should think, and probably deservedly so. But again, we've got a group of women here washing and water heater here on the ground nearby. But this woman is not happy about the attention she's getting from that young man. He may not, of course, have been Welsh. The next stage is to get to know each other before they decide to get married. And there was a custom in Wales known as bundling, which was generally approved of by the community. And the idea is that the young people spent an evening together either in the kitchen on hard seats or more comfortably in the young woman's bed, but with their clothes on, or most of them on, or with a barrier between them of some sort, like a rolled up blanket or even a plank of wood. So we've got one observer to this tradition. It's the only one we've got, and not surprisingly, and this is a man called Jackson who visited Mid Wales in 1770. And he said, "I was attending at supper by the daughter of the house, whom I could not help remarking for the neatness of her dress and that florid glow of nature. The ladies in our metropolis, by the assistance of art, by which he means makeup, are so fond of imitating." It was Saturday night, and I concluded she was expecting her lover, and my supposition was not ill-founded. He went up to bed, and the wall between his bedroom and that of the young woman was like this, which is at the cottage in Llanon, which the Ceredigion Museum owns. And in it, like this barrier between the two rooms, there were knot holes, and he looked through the knot hole and he saw the young women taking off some, but not all of their clothes. And then the young man came in and he just took off his hat and his shoes, and they got into bed together. And then Jackson says, "We will now put a veil over this and leave the rest to your imagination." And the chances are that they spent most of the night talking to get to know each other well. And then the young man, who had probably walked several miles to the farm where the young woman lived, the following morning he had to walk back to work because it was the only opportunity they had to meet each other. The other opportunities would have been fairs and other people's weddings. Socializing at church and chapel was frowned upon generally, so there wasn't much opportunity other than bundling, really, to get to know each other. Once they decided to get married in West Wales, people would have a bidding wedding, and the bidding means that they were bidding their friends, all their friends and neighbours, to attend not the wedding itself, which they may have attended, but the wedding feast afterwards, at which they were expected to give the new couple a small sum of money, which would be returned when somebody in their family got married. So this is a loan, not necessarily a gift. And I've recently been working on this, and I found 400 of these letters surviving, which is really quite astonishing. And I'm doing some more analysis on this. In this case, the young woman, once she got married, would be given a dowry by her parents, and that could range in size from a few pounds to a substantial sum of money, plus other things for the new home, and for and also possibly things for the farm. The young man would be strictly responsible for getting the farm building through his parents, presumably, and providing some of the furniture. And then the other thing that the young woman was responsible for was getting the bedding and other fabrics for the house itself. So she would be gathering that while she'd been working, and put it in her bottom drawer. And there's good evidence that that sort of thing happened. So here we have an account for a young woman called Anne Williams in 1839. And this is the money she spent from her earnings. She was paid £4 per annum for working as a servant on a farm, plus some potatoes, and the farmer would give her the potatoes. He would keep the money he's supposed to give her annually until she asked for small sums to spend at a fair or in the town at market. And you can see she spent 4 shillings on shoes, 3 shillings, 1.5 pence on net and lace, 1 shilling and a penny for stockings, 4 shillings for making a gown, and then 3 shillings for having the gown made out of the fabric. I'm not certain what a tucker was. It may have been something that was literally tucked in. But you get tucking mills, so I'm not quite sure what that represents. And then another 2 shillings for making her gown. So this is her bottom drawer, ready for getting married. It's very, very unusual to get images of pregnant women, but this really does look a bit like Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem. And here is what I think must be a pregnant woman on her way to possibly back from market, back home. And then, of course, once the couple are married and they start having babies, then it was the women's work to do the childcare. This picture is packed full of health and safety issues. The sharp knife held by the young boy in the front and the proximity of the fire by the other young children. But obviously that was a major part of the women's work. Cooking was very important, but we have no pictures of people cooking. This is extremely odd Christmas postcard of a woman stirring something in a large pot outside her cottage. And it may be to do with washing or brewing, but certainly the brewing, I think, would have been done indoors. So I'm not quite sure what she's up to there. And it is a very odd picture, but it's the only one we've got of a woman with a large cooking pot. And women were also responsible on farms for the milking. And here we've got a lovely image of the milk pails here on the left, and a milk stool and another milk pail here. And they're having a wash in the River Dyfi. And here are some tourists, quite a few of whom noticed that young women would undress and wash in the rivers and in the sea in this way. But milking was the task that they had allocated to them. Washing was a major task as well. And this is a wonderful picture at Llanrwst. There's the bridge behind. And there they all are busy working with their clothes slightly undone. And so this is one of the few times we can see their underclothes here. But it was a major task, taking up a large part of 1 or 2 days a week, I imagine. What's interesting about this is that there's almost no colour in it except white and blue. But if we look at the original oil painting, from which which was based on that print, I think, you can see this one was wearing a red cloak. I think it's more likely to have been blue, because blue was the colour of cloaks at that time in North Wales. And there's a lot more colour and a lot less white. And this white, of course, would be bedding and tablecloths, I assume, as well. And another image of Welsh washerwomen. There are many pictures of women washing. That's mainly because the tourists saw them, because they were doing it outside by streams and rivers and lake edges, which this might be, of course. And the colours are always different, because these are black and white prints, and then they're hand coloured, probably by somebody who's never been to Wales. So although the colours of Welsh costumes are quite bright, they may not have been quite like this. And these look like solid wooden clogs, but they weren't common in Wales, and I don't think that was accurate. Once the milk had been collected, then there's churning to do to make it into butter. And there's this lovely photograph of an elderly woman doing it. And it's the only picture that I know of somebody churning. And of course, many women would be involved in farming at harvest time. And this is, again, a lovely picture, mostly women here, working with the harvest, leading the horse to the farm with a cart full of hay, and the rake on the back of the woman here in the middle, and their low, wide-brimmed hats. And we've got Richard Gough, who's an English antiquarian who visited Wales in 1770, saying, in reaping, the women often excel the men, and by outgoing them, become king or lord, as it is called, of the field. The women seem more acute and intelligent than the men, which may be one reason for them doing so much of the men's business, while the men indulge with company and ale. So there's another damnation of the men and another praise for the women of Wales. This really interesting picture is from the National Museum of Wales. And I'm not quite sure what they're doing. They've all got their aprons bunched up in front of them, and many of them have got small sticks, but I'm not certain whether they're gathering stones or planting or gleaning. But we've got another description of the women working in Narberth, in this case, in mid-Pembrokeshire, in a formal report at the end of the 18th century. Women assisted in halving and in harvesting and in weeding and stone picking. Their earnings are very considerable. Employment for labourers, wives and children is much wanted. They are often seen basking in the sun in summer and shivering over a stolen wood fire in the winter than in any profitable exertions. So in this case, it's not quite so much praise of the women. He's suggesting they could have worked harder and earned more. And of course, there were many other things to do on the farm, which the women would be doing when the men were out in further out in the fields. So they would help in various ways. And here's the report on land in Wales, saying the daughters do all the work on the farm that the men would do, with the exception of ploughing. They work very, very hard, both mother and daughters. So more praise there for the women's work. And then things changed with the introduction of the Education Act in 1870. A lot more young women learned how to read and write. They had more choice about moving to towns and becoming domestic servants, which they preferred to doing work in the fields. There were two problems there. One is that the men refused to do the work the women used to do. Somebody had to do it though, so presumably they did do it in the end. And as we'll see, the quality of the work changed, because as the women left the farms to the towns, it is suggested that the quality of cheese production decreased. The women were extremely skillful at doing these tasks, such as butter and cheese making, which needed a lot of knowledge and understanding of the temperatures and the qualities of the milk and so on. And that skill left as the women went to work elsewhere. Winnowing was another task that women did. It seems they did almost everything on the farm except ploughing. So this woman is holding a very large winnowing tray to separate the chaff from the grain. And of course, many farms would have had chickens and private houses too, but I cannot believe that a woman would wear her fine Welsh hat doing a task like this, especially since she couldn't possibly get into the chicken house with it on. This is one of a series of postcards that were staged, and all the women in those postcards doing tasks outside are wearing hats with a bright coloured band around the edge of the brim. Then we turn to the sea. Of course, women generally didn't go to sea to work. The young men did, and of course the older men too, for months on end. But the women might work by the sea, and so we got cockle gatherers. This is at the base of Constitution Hill in Aberystwyth. There's where the castle is. And here are a group, I think mostly men, gathering cockles, but it does make me think that it's the woman that's in charge of all that. And it wouldn't surprise me. And in other parts of Wales, Langham in South Pembrokeshire on the Milford Haven, and around the Conwy Valley and the Menai Straits, there were people gathering various forms of shell food, including oysters. And that was a major task for them. And some of those individuals selling their goods at market became very famous and had their photographs taken. This is in a studio. The back cloth is a painted studio, and these are probably papier-mâché rocks. And she had her photograph taken several times because she became famous. This wonderful picture of the late 19th century of cockle gatherers in South Wales on the Gower. Beautifully dressed women working in a very cold, damp and hard-working situation, carrying large numbers of wet cockles home in baskets on their head, boiling them up for sale in market the next day. So a big job for many of probably the younger women doing that before they got married. Then there's looking after the home, domestic work, and here we have this very famous painting by Colonel Vosper. The other one, of course, is Salem, the picture of the chapel in North Wales. And here is the woman gathering materials that she wants to sell at market: eggs, butter, cheese, possibly some bread, and possibly some live animals as well. But around her is all this lovely furniture. The painting is early 19th century, but most of that furniture is late 18th or early 19th century, and has been carefully tended by the women of the house, I'm sure, polished regularly, kept clean and looked after. And the main reason for that is that this was their portable valuables. Many of them would have rented a cottage, so if they lost the use of that cottage, they could take the furniture with them to somewhere else or sell it if need be. And most of that furniture, of course, has survived through all that tender loving care for current generations to appreciate. And so much of it has survived because it was so well looked after by the women, I suspect. So here she is preparing for market. For her, it would have been a source of pocket money. She was also responsible, I imagine, for keeping the house clean, looking after the furniture. But the big question is, what happened when she was ill or infirm? Did her husband do any of that work? Of course, it varied from house to house, but we simply don't know. This is a very well-known image of women going to market. And I always imagine that this is the farmer's wife here, who had always knitted and couldn't stop knitting. So she was still knitting on her way to market with a large number of stockings there ready for sale in the market. Those stockings then went for sale through middlemen to England and beyond. And I imagine this as being the farmer's daughter, who was well off enough not to have to work, i.e. knit. She's got a fine Welsh hat, a lovely umbrella, and a fine shawl with paisley designs on it, and a dress rather than a skirt and gown. Here on the left, we've got a woman wearing a very typical Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire type of gown. You don't find them in other parts of Wales, and a beautifully black and red striped skirt, and what is called a bedgown underneath, a printed cotton gown, as this woman has. And here's another woman, and a maidservant. Both of these are maidservants, I think, for the farm. One's wearing a straw hat. The other one has a man's hat, rather like a bowler, with a pad on top of it, and then this very large metal container on her head, and she's carrying a basket, possibly of rolls or some, it's not quite clear what they are. And you can see she's walking barefoot, but she's got stockings going down to her ankles and hooked over one of her toes, which was very common then. And 4 women and 1 man in the picture, and the boy. So, as I said, it wasn't unusual for women to walk barefoot. We've got this lovely description in 1732, one of the very first tourists to Wales, English tourist, saying the maid at the inn at Cardigan, being dressed in her best clothes because it was Sunday, in the evening put on her everyday clothes and laid by her shoes and stockings, waiting upon us as usual bare-legged. Only, I presume, to be worn on high days. So the stockings and the shoes were only worn on special days. And here's another lovely picture by an amateur artist in mid-Wales of 2 young women, a child, all barefoot, and what appears to be an older woman taking off or putting on her shoes and stockings. You can see one shoe is down on the ground and one of the stockings is in her hand. And it's well known from what the tourist said is that the women used to walk barefoot from home to market, put their shoes and stockings on at market, and then take them off as they were leaving to return home. We don't know whether that's because they were trying to save shoe leather, or because they were happier walking barefoot, or because they wanted to look smarter in town and protect their feet from perhaps broken glass and other things that might be around the town streets. And there's some lovely illustrations of the sort of costume worn by the people in Neath area here. This is where this picture comes from. And you probably know the famous story of Mary Jones and her Bible walking miles to get a Bible barefooted. Well, it was quite normal. That was what happened at the time. So it would be very usual for a young woman to walk miles barefoot. Another example of women multitasking. This is the wonderful Catherine Hutton, who wrote some beautiful diaries of her 4 tours to Wales at the end of the 18th century. I have 100 times seen a woman carrying a pitcher of water on her head. A child will loaf in this wrapper and knitting as she walked along. Well, this woman doesn't have a child in her wrapper, but here we have pictures of just that happening. This is a picture with a bilingual title, Welsh costumes, the mode of carrying infants in Wales. And I found evidence now that this is something that was practiced all over Wales, that women carried babies in a shawl in front of them, not on the back, as is found in some other countries. And there's this lovely photograph of it, of a real case. It's early 20th century, as you can see, at the Senghenith pit disaster where so many men were killed. And this looks like a young girl with a baby wrapped up in the shawl, as was done, a plain coloured soft shawl with very long tassels on. And it shows very clearly that you could carry a baby in this way and have both hands free. So you could be knitting or peeling potatoes or doing some other task at the same time as caring for your baby. And there's lots and lots of illustrations and descriptions of that in practice throughout Wales. Another wonderful picture of a group of women going to market, crossing by a ferry at Swansea in the 1830s, all wearing their best Welsh hats. And I think they did that because it helped sell their goods. The people at the market liked to buy from people who were well-dressed and smart. And the chances are, if you wore a Welsh hat, you could also speak Welsh. And that might have been an advantage to some people who were buying and selling. And another picture, again back to the late 18th century, of what was described as the peculiar dress of the peasantry around Newcastle Emlyn. And you can see all the women dressed in very much the same way with their men's hats. Even the young girl is dressed in the same way. I don't think the colours are right on this. The blue is, but the white and the brown is very unusual. There's almost no other pictures of that. So I think this is, again, the same artist as I showed previously of the women washing, where the oil colour would have had a bit more colour in it. And another group, an amateur artist at the market hall, where the clock tower is now in Aberystwyth, sitting around selling their goods to those who were in town. And they would have carried those in the morning and taken what was left in the evening and bought a few things with the money they gained from sales. And this is one of the very earliest photographs we got of Wales, which isn't quite staged. This is by a very famous photographer called Bedford. This is his wife, who appears in a lot of his photographs, and this is his carriage, which he took himself and his wife around in, and all his photography equipment, including the processing materials that he needed for developing and printing the photos, certainly developing the negatives. And here we got a group of women in Welsh costume with items for sale, which they were taking round from house to house. So they didn't just sell the items at market, they went from door to door selling their eggs and butter and cheese and various other things. And here, another wonderful picture, I think, of women on their way home from market in the evening, looking exhausted after a good day's work, and probably an early morning departure from home. And hopefully they've sold enough to make enough money to keep them going for a bit longer. And a similar view, 1835, of the sands near Barmouth, of people, I think, going home rather than going to work. And you can see again that what looks like a boy in this case, which is unusual, with a large container on his head, like the metal one we saw earlier. This picture, which I used for the advert for this talk, was printed in a magazine, I think in the 1860s or 70s. And it's of a woman walking up Constitution Hill on her way home to Borth. She'd almost certainly have filled this basket on her back with dried peat, which she sold at the market. And there's good evidence that peat was being sold in the market at Aberystwyth. So they dug up the peat in Borth bog, dried it, put it in these baskets and carried it to 5-6 miles, if not more, along this coastal path. And this is one of the baskets that has survived. Very, very few of them survive because they're extremely fragile. It's in Ceredigion Museum now. And I bought this painting for Ceredigion Museum quite a few years ago, because partly because it was by a famous architect who worked on some buildings in Aberystwyth. And it's a Borth bog, and there are very few pictures of the bog of this sort. And I wasn't sure what this was for some time. And then I realized that it was one of these women with a very large basket on her back, carrying the peat to Aberystwyth market. There are lots of pictures of women carrying baskets like this, and these two examples, they've got the peat in them in northern Scotland. So it's not unusual, you're not unique to Wales. But here's another Scottish one, and it's very rare to see men having these baskets on their back. And here are two men with such baskets on their back, but they're being carried through the water by these very strong women. It is a very funny picture, I think, and it just shows you the difference in the way that the men and women worked. And sadly, the baskets like this are still being used. This was taken in Iraq about 20 years ago, and the basket itself is full of landmines. So women carrying things of this sort in large baskets on their back has not gone away. Spinning, of course, was a very important task, but there are very, very few descriptions and illustrations of them, possibly because it was something that was also common in England. Generally, the things that the tourists describe were the things that were unique to Wales. So it's only at the end of the century we start getting pictures of women spinning, and they almost certainly no longer use spinning wheels like that. They just brought them out for the photographs. Knitting, as I've already mentioned, was a very important part of the work for women. It's something you could do almost at any time while you were doing some other task. You could be walking, talking, knitting, and at meetings. I've been to Eisteddfodau where people in the audience was busily knitting during the concert, that sort of thing. And it's quite interesting to see that the same sort of image appears over and over again in different pictures. It's almost certainly one copy from the rest. And this one, you can see the string holding the pig in place is there. However, very, very few stockings have survived, partly because those that were worn have been worn out. So none of the footless stockings have survived that we know of anywhere. Partly because most of the ones knitted in Wales were sold to England and beyond. And some of them were made specially not to be worn during life, but to be worn in death. And these were made especially to be worn in a coffin. And that's why they've got the name Annie Phillips knitted into them. And there are about 8 of these, 3 or 4 in Tregaron. They were on display there, and several in St Fagans. And you can see this one has been repaired. So I wonder whether this one was cast aside when Annie Phillips died, and she was put in a better pair, and this has survived by chance. But almost nothing survives from that time. So finally, we look at some of the industrial work that women did. This is on the Isle of Anglesey, where the women were employed in breaking up the rocks that had the copper ore in it. Very tedious, hard job, I suspect. They're just using heavy stone hammers to break up the rock into small pieces. The man up here, of course, is breaking the rock from the natural, and they are smashing the small bits. So women were employed in heavy industry. And one thing that I find really interesting is that they would have worn really scruffy clothes. And this is one of the very, very few photographs we've got of the same people in their best clothes and in their daily work clothes. It's extremely unusual to get the two together. And they were both photographed by the same famous photographer, who was a Ceredigion man, but not moved to North Wales. So this is what they would worn every day. And it doesn't look a lot like Welsh costume, because it isn't. And there they are in their very anglicised Sunday best. But there are other drawings of women in their hard-working clothes. And this rather unusual chap, Manby, who went round some of the mines and other places in South Wales, drawing the women doing the heavy work. They tended not to work underground, they worked on the surface. And we got these, what are known as pit head girls in really scruffy clothes, perfectly suitable, of course, for the job they were doing, which was heavy work on the surface of the pits in South Wales. This one taken by a Tredigga photographer. There was one other job that people did not talk about or write about at all, but I'm sure it went on, and this is known in Welsh as siop o dan a feddog. The shop under her apron, which is the work of a prostitute. But nobody talked about that in any way at all, but it was there. I think I'm going to leave these out. Here's another job that women would have done. If you know Lark Rise to Candleford, you'd know the main character was a postwoman who walked miles with her leather bag with the letters. And here is one in a drawing. And you can see again, women knitting, looking after babies. And this is very similar to one of the other pictures where there's a woman with a metal container not on her head in this case, but down by the side of her. And then in towns, you might have women helping those who wanted to take the waters. So these women would have spent a lot of time. And if it's true that taking the waters was good for your health, then these must have been very healthy women indeed. Well, now come to Pontrhydd and two tourists spent a night in Newcastle Emlyn in appalling conditions, and they decided not to have breakfast there and walk to Lampeter, where they hoped to get breakfast. But sadly, the town was absolutely full of soldiers and there wasn't a single place to get a meal. So they went on to Pontrhydd and got to the shop there, where they met this woman who refused to serve them because they were pedestrians. And generally, people didn't trust pedestrians. They were much happier with people on horseback or in carriages. But ultimately, she gave in and did sell them some tea. And you can see the teapot there and the plates, which the visitors said were picturesquely chipped. They described the bed as being Elizabethan, with the fabric on it almost as old as Elizabeth herself. First Elizabeth. There's a lovely cobweb in the corner. So there is a picture local to you of a place where they may have also been selling other things like candles and food of various sorts. And a similar sort of view in Llanarth of the interior of a cottage, which was also let out for people to stay the night, with a crog loft above and a massive dresser full of china or possibly pewter plates and a box bed underneath. One of the things that I think the women probably did very well was to maintain traditions. So here they all are at St David's by the Central Cross in 1882, when the Duke of Edinburgh visited, and they put on their Welsh costume, which they probably weren't wearing very much, except for very special occasions at that time. But they carefully preserved the Welsh hats, which were quite fragile. And there they all are dressed up in their best costumes. And the Duke of Edinburgh gave them all a packet of tea. It's very kind of him. Quite how much the women were involved in music and dancing, we do not know, because, as I said at the beginning, very little is written about their contribution. I'm sure they were involved in some way, but we just don't know. This is the hidden history for women. But it's quite likely that they were singing and dancing. And of course, they did take part in some Eisteddfod competitions, but not for the chair or the crown. And of course, many women outlived their husbands. So we got this, again, rather sad postcard, a gadair wag, the empty chair, spending perhaps decades on their own. Again, she's busy knitting, but of course, this is a staged photograph. And the other thing that the women tended to do more than the men was to tend the graves, both immediately after a funeral and on Seal of Blodau, Flower Sunday. And this is yet another bilingual print produced at the time for tourists and possibly for the local population as well. So we finally come to this picture of 3 young women in Welsh costume in 1994. Sioned now works for the Welsh government in Cardiff. Emily, in the middle, works for the Scottish government as a lawyer. She's the only Welsh-speaking person, I think, working for the Welsh government. And Fionn is a consultant radiographer. Now, these 3 young girls had a good education, lots of choices, and the almost certain guarantee of a good job. The young women of Wales in the 18th and 19th century had none of those choices. They had almost no choice at all about what happened to them unless they chose to run away from the system. And my feeling is that they may not have had the choices, but they may have been content. I'm not certain that these 3 young women are as happy as they might be, despite all those choices, possibly because they got too many. But is this history as wished for? We would like to think the young women of Wales in the 18th and 19th century were happy and content, but perhaps they weren't. We simply don't know because they didn't write about themselves. And perhaps they grew up turning into young women and older women who looked a bit more like this. I've just bought this photograph from eBay. It's a really good photograph because it's one of the very few where the women are not wearing the full traditional costume. And they don't look particularly happy either. So it's really nice to have something like this, which might be more of the reality of women's life in 18th and 19th century Wales than the tourists would like us to think. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Michael. That was a fascinating talk, and I particularly enjoyed the lack of division between the roles. I thought that was really interesting, that now we might see that in the past there were traditional roles that were strictly for men and strictly for women, whereas it seems like there was much more overlap, particularly with women doing what are seen as traditionally male roles.
Yes.
And working not only just as hard, but likely a lot harder than the men were working. If anybody's got any questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can have a discussion. One quick question while we see if any others come in. You mentioned a few times the traditional dress of different areas, so sort of the Ceredigion traditional dress and things like that. Did each area have a very distinct dress, or was it something which some areas have a very distinctive one, but others it was more similar?
No, it is quite clear that Cardiganshire and Carmarthenshire had a particular dress, and that was the gown with the long black and red stripes. They're often called bedgowns, but that's the wrong term for them. So that's the long tail gown. Pembrokeshire, they had plain coloured, shorter gowns. In North Wales, they wore what are called bedgowns, very much like the woman sitting in the middle here, a loose cotton gown with short or long sleeves, often long, and just tied around the waist with the apron. And in Neath, Fort Talbot, they had check fabrics. and they also wore bedgowns in southeast Wales. So it is possible to show that there were regional variations. Some people think you can tell you which valley a woman came from the nature of her costume. I don't think that's possible because we don't have the firm evidence for that. My other website, I've got one website on what tourists said about Wales. I've got another one on Welsh costume, and there's a vast amount of information on that called welshhatgod.wordpress.com. And you can find out a lot about what I've been able to discover about Welsh costume on that.
Oh, that's great. I'll send the link out in the follow-up email after the event. I've had a comment and a question from Karen Lamb. She says, "Thank you very much for a very interesting talk." And then she said, "We heard that some young men stayed in dodgy accommodation overnight, but where did most tourists sleep when they were sort of visiting the area?"
In inns, they were the only place you could stay. Most towns and the larger villages had an inn. Most inns were about 20 miles apart, and most tourists walked 20 to 30 miles a day. It wasn't at all unusual for them to manage that. They were fit, young, healthy people, most of them. And the women often travelled the same way, although most of the women, I think, women tourists would have travelled on horseback or in a carriage, but some women walked. So there were inns at a comfortable distance apart. So the prevalence of New Inn in Wales, the place named New Inn, there are many of them, is where it was a New Inn was required, mostly for tourists and travellers. And they would be generally quite good. The food was often quite good, but not always. And it certainly improved as more travellers came.
Oh, it's really interesting. And how, if they were sort of, as you say, quite significant distances, but people would probably follow quite a route, that they'd probably stop at one which had a good reputation and then kind of follow on to another, maybe. Well,
they really had no choice. They would, if they travelled 10 or 15 miles, there would only be 1 or 2 inns within walking distance of that before it got dark.
Yeah, and
you would walk from Cardigan to Abereiron, and there would be one big inn in Abereiron, and you get to Aberystwyth, and there were 2 or 3 big inns there, and then Machynlleth, where there might be 1 or 2. And if the inns were full, there was very little you could do except sleep rough or sleep on a comfortable chair in the inn rather than in the bed.
Yeah, very different for today's tourists. We've got another comment from Ellen Jones, and she says, "Just an observation, in the photo of Sengenedd, it is indeed a young girl holding a baby. Her neighbour had asked her to mind the baby while she went to try and find out about her husband. I was told this by her granddaughter."
Oh gosh, how wonderful. Thank you, Ellen.
Fascinating.
That is fabulous. But it is such a wonderful photograph. I think she was there and was just brought forward by a photographer to be in the view. But I don't think that's quite as staged as some of the other photographs are.
Yeah.
That's wonderful to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating talk, and particularly I've been working on preparing our exhibition, which is opening from Saturday the 31st of July, and lots of the objects kind of tie into women's work and women's role in the family, along with other things such as, you know, spinning and sort of the making of clothes and things like that. So it's it's been a really good bit of background for me as well. I really enjoyed it. If anybody else does have any further questions, if you want to send them on, email them on to me at info@strataflorida.org.uk, and I can pass them on to Michael and get them answered for you. The talk will also be available on YouTube, probably from around tomorrow. And if you have enjoyed the talk, we obviously offer all our talks for free, but we do have a local giving page where we're trying to raise money for our grandfather clock to be restored, which will be one of our items in our new exhibition. But I'll put the link in the chat. So if you would like to donate, that would be greatly appreciated. I think that's all. And if any more comments or questions come through, I will forward them on to you, Michael. And thanks again.
Right, of course, happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's right there.
That's like that.